As we begin the Sefer Shemos, and we read about the narration of the subjugation of Klal Yisrael in Egypt, and ultimately the redemption from the land itself by Moshe Rabbeinu, we're going to read of a very important theme of Hakaras HaTov, of a sense of gratitude to any individual who performed something on our behalf, providing us with something in our hour of need. And indeed, we will be informed in next week's Seder Va'era that Moshe Rabbeinu was not permitted by HaKadosh Baruch Hu to perform the first three makos of Dam, Tzfardeya, and Kinim, because Moshe Rabbeinu had been effectively saved and protected by the waters of the Nile River, and therefore he was not permitted to turn it to blood, nor was he permitted to extract frogs from them. And he wasn't permitted to bring forth Kinim, lice, from the desert sands of Egypt, because he had hidden the body of the Mitzri whom he smites in this week's Seder of Shemos, when he notes that he is beating upon the husband of Shlomo Bas Divri. And this notion of Hakaras HaTov, even though it's first mentioned, as it were, in the Seder of Va'era, I believe that it really traces its roots to this Seder of Shemos in the following way. Were we to ask ourselves, what pasuk in this week's Seder of Shemos really begins the subjugation of Klal Yisrael? I think that most would answer at the pasuk that describes the turning of the king of Egypt to his nation, Vayomer Alamo, saying, Hine am b'nei Yisrael rav v'otzu mimenu. Behold, look how quickly this people are multiplying. They're going to overtake us in numbers, and when and if we will be attacked by an opposing enemy, they will bond and collaborate with our opposition and force us out of our land of Egypt itself. And therefore they saw to it that they were subjugated. They had to begin strengthening the fortifications in Pisam and Ramses, all the way up to the degree that Asher Avdu Behem Befarach, that they were effectively subjugated and placed into servitude, where there was work that was assigned them that was not simply physically backbreaking, but Befarach was emotionally backbreaking, assigning work normally assigned to women, assigning it to men, and work normally assigned to men, assigning it to women. But this notion of Hakaras HaTov that is found in the Seder of Va'era going forward, I think really is found in our Seder, because the subjugation, I believe, does not begin with a pasuk where the king turns to his nation and hatches the plan of subjecting the Jews under the Egyptian whip, but rather the previous pasuk that states, Vayakam melech chadash ha-Mitzrayim, and there arose a new king over Egypt, Asher lo yada as Yosef, who didn't know Yosef. And here we have provided for us the machlokas between Amara and Rav and Shmuel. Chad Omar Mamish, V'chad Omar. One maintained that he was literally a new king, Melech Chadash HaMitzrayim, where the other was of the opinion that Shenischachik Zerosov. He wasn't new, but rather what? He was the same old king, but he came up with an entire new corpus of laws. And that was withstanding the fact that one could ask, what's the difference? He still passed all the laws against the Jews. The difference, I believe, is enormous, because the king of Egypt, who never served with Yosef HaTzadik, even though he certainly read about him in the Chronicles of Egypt, as mentions the Sforno, but he could say, I have nothing to do with him. I didn't work with him. I didn't work for him. I had no association. I have nothing that I owe to him personally, and therefore I could do whatever I want. In such great contrast to a king that had worked with Yosef, and whose country was saved by none other than Yosef HaTzadik, with his administration of the safeguarding of the food in those 7 years of plenty, and then its distribution in the 7 years of famine that followed. Why, the entire Middle Eastern area that purchased food from Egypt was saved by the viceroy of Egypt, who was second only to the king, Paro himself. And for such a king, not a Melech Chadash, but such a king who knew Yosef well, for whom Yosef was a son, as it were. Well, when the Jews saw such a king totally forget what Yosef had contributed to the Egyptian society, when the Jews saw such a king who worked with Yosef day in and out, who unquestionably, I'm sure, loved Yosef for what Yosef accomplished, whom Yosef showed endless deference for, when the Jews saw such a king, that he could do such a thing, Why, that was the beginning of the subjugation, emotionally and mentally. Because in life, there are very few moments that are as awkward as when you are suddenly hurt by someone whom you felt so loved by, and suddenly you feel as if you never had any relationship at all without that individual. That's when the avodas parach begins. And we know in life that often, all too often in life, we hurt most the ones we love. Not intentionally, God forbid, but by negligence. And we have to be so careful to understand that it is specifically those whom we love and those whom we have relationships with that we need be so careful with, and we need treat so preciously and so appropriately. Because if there was ever a moment of change within the history of Klal Yisrael in Egypt, it was specifically when a king arose who knew Yosef well, who knew the Jewish people well, and suddenly all of his love changed so drastically. And that was the moment that the Shibud began. Have a great Shabbos.